Thank you, Father Francis. I am a deacon in the Dominican order, and so I've almost completed 7 years of formation in the order. Part of that formation is we have 2 years of philosophical studies and 4 years of theology, and we often get an MA in the midst of doing those studies. And I got an MA in philosophy. And the topic of my thesis for that MA was Edith Stein's understanding of individual being, what it is to be an individual, and comparing her with St. Thomas Aquinas. We're not going to talk about that tonight. But over the course of those studies, I read almost all of what Edith Stein has, what we have published in English at least, from St. Edith Stein, became very familiar with her works in general and her life, trying to understand her metaphysics and her philosophy. And so that's what this talk sort of springs out of, all of that background information that comes out of writing the thesis. So let's just get started. St. Edith Stein, philosopher and saint. There we go. Okay. There's a little picture of little Edith on the top there. Edith Stein was born in Breslau, Germany, which is currently in Poland. There's a picture of the town. It's a false colorization that's been added to it, but you can see around the time that she was born. She was born on October 12th in 1891, which on that year was the date of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So she was born in a Jewish family. Her mother was a very devout Jew. The fact that her youngest child, was born on Yom Kippur was very special to her. This Day of Atonement, and it is a theme. It's almost a kind of prophetic occurrence that then is traced, especially in the end of her life, that she is born on this Day of Atonement. She is the 11th child of the family, the 7th surviving child. Her father died when she was 21 months old. And so with her father's death, her mother took over the family lumber business, and actually apparently did a better job running the business than her father ever did. Was extremely successful in it. Because of that, though, Edith winds up being raised by her older sisters. At a very early age, she showed signs of great intelligence, and also signs of great stubbornness. She did very well in school, and nevertheless, at the age of about 15, she decided she was just going to drop out, and she was going to become a domestic. She was going to learn the domestic life, so she dropped out of school and went to live with her sister and her brother-in-law. That didn't last very long. She was apparently very unimpressed with it and returned to school after 6 months. But nobody could have told her not to do that. She made the decision all on her own. Many years later, the sisters that she lived with would recount that she had no idea how to sweep. She couldn't sew. All of her sewing had to be redone quietly by somebody else. She never really learned some of the basics of the domestic life that was expected of young women at that time. As I said, she was born in a very devout Jewish family. And yet, by the time she was a teenager, she professed to be an atheist, to have stopped praying. And yet at the same time, there was always a very deep interiority about her, a very deep contemplative aspect to her. We see in this photo the Stein family. You'll notice little Edith down there does not look 21 months old, and yet right in the center is a picture of her father. Apparently they knew how to Photoshop back then, even before Photoshop came into play. So this was taken 2 years after their father's death. And yet here we have the whole family together with her mother in the center next to her father. In 1911, she went to the University of Breslau to study psychology. Psychology, though, at that time was not what we normally think of as psychology. We'll talk a little bit more about the sort of philosophical history leading up to this time. But psychology at that point had become the foundation of all studies. Okay? With Immanuel Kant, there was this idea, this philosophical idea, that we could never actually get to the outside world. We could never actually get to the things themselves. All we could do is we could study how we projected our world onto the outside world. And so what really became interesting was studying the way the human mind works. And so all of the sciences sort of get reduced to psychology. Logic becomes a study either of just how you use good reason, good judgment, or it becomes a study of how evolution has wired the brain to think in a way that's advantageous to us, but not actually a study of reality. Okay? So psychology really was all that was left of philosophy at the time, in many respects. That's what she begins her studies in. She encountered, however, one summer, a book by a man named Edmund Husserl called The Logical Investigations. And this completely changed her entire perspective on the philosophical enterprise, and she decided to leave the University of Breslau and to follow after Husserl, who is at the University of Göttingen. And so in 1913, she left and went to become a student of his. Edmund Husserl had himself become completely disenchanted with the psychology of the time, the psychologism of the time, this reduction of logic to basically a function of psychology. And so he developed this new branch of philosophy called Phenomenology. And phenomenology was his way of breaking out of this psychologism and showing how it was problematic and how really philosophy needed to be first. Philosophy needed to be prior to all of the sciences, including psychology. His work was extremely influential. We don't see it very much in the United States or in the English-speaking world, but on the continent it was extremely influential and changed a number of people's lives and changed the way people were thinking about philosophy at the time. Most of the 20th century thought that we have coming out of Europe has its roots right here with the logical investigations and can be traced back to Edmund Husserl. Edith Stein wrote, "When one gets to Göttingen, the first place to go is to Reinecke. He arranges all the rest." Adolf Reinecke was the first doctoral student of Edmund Husserl, and he was apparently the one who understood Edmund Husserl the best. In fact, Husserl would say that Reinecke understood him better than he did his own self. Reinecke was also a phenomenal teacher, which Edmund Husserl was not. Nobody understood what Husserl was talking about. Nobody really understood what he was writing. Reinecke did, and he was able to explain it. So if you showed up to study under Husserl, the first thing you did was you took classes under Adolf Reinecke. He was able to explain phenomenology. And I think especially when we look at phenomenology, we'll talk about more, but there's quite a wide range of different branches of phenomenology, different ways of pursuing it. To understand St. Edith Stein, to understand most of the great Catholic phenomenologists, I think the best place to look is with Adolf Reinecke and his understanding of phenomenology. You can find a short paper that he has. It's called Concerning Phenomenology. You can find that online very easily in an English translation. He says, to talk about phenomenology is the most useless thing in the world. So long as that is lacking, which alone can give any talk concrete fullness and intuitiveness. The phenomenological way of seeing and the phenomenological attitude. Phenomenology is not a matter of a system of philosophical propositions and truths. A system of propositions in which all who call themselves phenomenologists must believe, and which I could here prove to you. But rather, it is a method of philosophizing which is required by the problems of philosophy. So phenomenology is not in itself, as Reinach understood it, a kind of doctrine. It's not a system of beliefs. It is a method of doing philosophy. Okay? So there's a big distinction there that's important. Just a little bit more on the sort of intellectual background. In the 17th century, we have Rene Descartes coming on the scene. Okay? And Rene Descartes sort of changes the philosophical world completely. He tries to start from scratch. And he tries to get to the things that cannot be doubted. So he engages in this exercise of doubting everything until he can find something that he can't doubt. As Frederick Cobblestone put it, no one doubted that the world existed until Rene Descartes proved that it did. And so for the rest of the philosophical enterprise, almost until the 20th century, you have this huge problem of we're not quite sure how to get out of our own minds and into the rest of the world. How to prove that everything out there actually exists. How to actually come in contact with the world. We've forgotten how to do that with Descartes. And it becomes this great struggle. Kant eventually, Immanuel Kant, claims you just can't do it. Right? It's just a failed enterprise to get outside of your own mind. All you have is the phenomena, the experiences that are there. That's it. We can't get to the real world. To top it off, you have German idealism functioning. You can think of Hegel. Idealism, where you sort of construct a complete philosophical system first, then you go and you see how it fits onto the rest of the world and all of history. Okay, so this taking of a philosophical system first, you can also think of communism as based on this too. Communism has its history. This is the way everything happens in history. And that was sort of decided first, and then you go back and see how it actually does fit in all of history. This beginning with an ideal, a created system, and then implanting it on reality. So these are the things that Edmund Husserl is struggling against, that he's trying to get rid of. And the one thing that Edmund Husserl notices is that while you can doubt the existence of things, you cannot doubt that you are having an experience of them. I can doubt whether or not the podium exists. I can doubt whether or not you exist. I can't doubt the fact that I'm having an experience of the podium, of its solidity, of its color, okay, of its size and its shape. Okay? There's this element of experience that is indubitable. Whether or not it's true or false, it has any correspondence to reality, we can actually bracket that. And so rather than doubting that things exist, we just sort of bracket that off to the side. We're just not going to deal with the problem right away. Okay? It's a slightly different frame of mind, but it's a very important different frame of mind. Instead of doubting that something exists, we just say we're not going to worry about it right now. By bracketing off and recognizing that the experience itself cannot be doubted, we can then look at what he called the essence of things. We can intuit the essence of things, get to the things themselves. Okay, the essence as it presents itself. Alasdair MacIntyre has written a book on St. Edith Stein called The Philosophical Prologue to St. Edith Stein. I highly recommend it. It's something in between an academic work and a popular work. So if you're looking for something that's a little challenging, it's a great book for that. He explains the phenomenological intuition, what they mean by this intuiting of the essence, I think very well. He compares it to Van Gogh made a claim that he could see 19 distinct shades of white in another artist's painting. Okay? So Alasdair MacIntyre compares the intuition to this, and he says, such an ability requires sustained and focused attention on each particular color in each painting. It requires the development and exercise of capacities to recognize minute sameness and difference in color. To exclude one's attention, while focusing on color, of other features of those paintings, such as light, shadow, and form, and to notice the same colors in other perceptual contexts outside of painting. Okay. The phenomenological intuition is not such a simple experiencing. A lot of people will use the term phenomenology when all they're talking about is just their experience. The phenomenological intuition is a very deep delving into that experience. A very deep delving into that experience. It's something that does require a great deal of training and practice to be able to get to the depths of experience. By getting to, and I'll be reading an example from Edith Stein in a little bit, just to give you an idea. By getting to the essence of things, we can come to certain a priori truths, or necessary truths, necessary laws that govern those things. One of Edmund Husserl's examples was just looking at three-dimensional objects. Okay? When I look at a three-dimensional object, when I look at the chair that's here in front of me, the empty chair, okay, I grasp it as a three-dimensional object. And therefore, even though I can't see it, I know it has a backside. Right? I know it has a backside. I have no experience of that backside directly. But the very fact that I understand that I grasp the chair as a three-dimensional object means I know that it has a backside. Okay? Max Scheler would take this phenomenological intuition and talk about our values, and that there is actually an objective ordering of value, an objective way that things are valued. Adolf Reineck was also a lawyer, a civil lawyer, and so he did a phenomenology of law, which is absolutely fascinating. So he will look at things like the structure of a promise. What is a promise? Promise is a very strange thing, right? One person makes a promise to another person. And suddenly this promise has this kind of being, this kind of existence, okay, that's a little radically different than any other kind of existence that we know. Even if both people should forget the promise still, in a sense, stands. And if one should remember later, it can still be called to mind, right? So promises have this very strange structure that through a very detailed, very careful analysis can be developed and can be seen. The other thing that phenomenology will do is they'll always avoid definitions. And this makes them extremely frustrating to read. Okay? They avoid definitions because the definition is always something other than the thing itself. Okay? St. Thomas Aquinas will define joy, okay, as that possession of one's own good, or the knowledge that one's beloved possesses their own good. Right? And you can know that definition. You can know that definition. But if you've never experienced joy, do you really know joy? Right? The definition is not the thing itself. And so phenomenologists will always try to avoid definitions. What's characteristic of phenomenological writing is they'll sort of hold the thing up that they want to look at. And they'll talk about it. And they'll sort of walk around it. And as they come back around, they're able to give new insights because they've seen it all. And each time around, their insights are able to go deeper and deeper and deeper as they come to a deeper understanding of what it is they're looking at. And it really is a kind of meditation, and you have to follow them in their meditation in order to understand it. This kind of writing is characteristic of a certain pope who liked to employ phenomenology, namely John Paul II. So if you've ever found Pope John Paul II to be a little long-winded, if you've ever found that he seems to keep coming back to the same topic again and again and again, even within one work, okay, it's because of this sort of phenomenological method that he learned and that he engaged in. Okay? All right. So I'll give you an example. St. Edith Stein, in her dissertation on empathy, is dealing with this problem of how do we know that there are actually other persons? How do I know that you're not all a figment of my imagination? Okay, how do I know that you're not all robots? How do I know that you actually are other persons? How do I really grasp that? Okay? And how do I know that the outside world even exists? She begins with the body. Okay, she begins with reflections on her body. The body, compared to other physical objects, is a very strange object. Okay? And here's her description of it. This would be a real thing, a physical body whose motivated successive appearances exhibit striking gaps. It would withhold its rear side with more stubbornness than the moon and invite me continually to consider it from new sides. Yet as soon as I am about to carry out its invitation, it hides these sides from me. She's trying to look at her back. She's trying to look at her back, and every time she does, she can't see it. Right? No matter which way she turns, it disappears. Okay? This makes the back and the body a rather strange object in our field of vision. And the fact that you can't get around it. To be sure, things that withdraw from the glance are accessible to touch, so I can touch my back. But precisely the relationship between seeing and touching is different here than everywhere else. It's not like other objects. This unique defect of the outwardly perceived physical body is in contrast with another peculiarity. I can approach and withdraw from any other thing, can turn toward or away from it. Thus we say more precisely that every other object is given to me in an infinitely variable multiplicity of appearances and of changing positions. And there are also times when it is not given to me. So with every other object, right, I can see it from any angle I wish. I can see it from any distance I wish. I can turn my back on it and not see it at all. They can disappear. The body, on the other hand, is very limited in the ways that I can see it, in the ways that I can experience it. And it never goes away. As long as I have this one object, my physical body, is given to me in successive appearances, only variable with very narrow limits. As long as I have my eyes open at all, it is continually there with a steadfast obtrusiveness, always having the same tangible nearness as no other object has. It is always here, while other objects are always there. Okay? And this is just the beginning of her reflection on the body. As she continues on, she is able to show how we really can't argue against the body being part of who we are, who and what we are. Okay? That Descartes' idea that we are just a mind, a ghost within a machine, simply doesn't stand against our experience of our own bodies. Okay? As she continues on, she's able to recognize, now mind you, this is an atheist, a professed atheist. She's able to recognize the necessity of speaking about a soul. Okay? And even a soul that is a spiritual soul. And all of this comes out of her very, very, very careful analysis of basic experience. Any questions on phenomenology?
Do the Jews, do they believe they have a soul in the Jewish religion?
That would be a complex question.
Okay. Answer it.
There is the Hebrew language is of course quite different than the sort of Greco-Roman roots that we draw from, and so they will speak of the ruah, the life breath. Okay, they will speak of something like the interior, the soul, the life. So there is a concept similar to that. Yes.
Edith Stein just, although she was born and raised Jewish, she completely dropped her Jewish beliefs or whatever.
Can you repeat the question,
The question was, did she dropped her beliefs completely? She was born Jewish, but dropped her beliefs completely. She stopped praying to God, consciously. Stopped praying to God and called herself an atheist. When she was baptized, in the baptismal record, she had written down that she was an atheist that converted to Catholicism, not a Jew that converted to Catholicism. So that was her understanding of herself and her own position. Yeah. A couple of very important characters and friends of St. Edith Stein in the phenomenological world. Up in the top corner, top left corner, we have Max Scheler. Max Scheler, we could do a whole talk on Max Scheler's life as well. He is quite an interesting character, quite a tragic character as well. There was a short period in Max Scheler's life where he was living in the Catholic Church. He had a valid marriage to a very wonderful woman who was dedicated to him the rest of his life. And during that time, it was also his most prolific time of writing. And it was spectacular stuff that he was writing. He was a great friend of Edith Stein's at that time. His writings at that time also became very influential in John Paul II's work. So John Paul II did his habilitation, his second dissertation, on Max Scheler. And so he's a very important person to know and to understand in order to read John Paul II's work and to recognize some of the things that are going on there. Roman Ingarden was a Polish phenomenologist who had came to study under Husserl. He also has very close connections to John Paul II. He was a frequent conversation partner to the Bishop Karol Wojtyła in Poland. So he lived in Poland after the war and got to know John Paul II very well. And so was also influential in his work, in his later writings, bringing phenomenology into dialogue with Thomism, as John Paul II did. And then Dietrich von Hildebrand, tremendous Catholic intellectual of his time, and a phenomenologist, great friends with Max Scheler as well. And John Paul II speaks extremely highly of his works. His work, I'm going to forget the title. Look up works by Dietrich von Hildebrand. Anything you find is worth reading. He was very good at writing at a popular level. And so you see his phenomenology coming out, but it's also things that are made for everybody to be reading. And they're spectacular. World War I broke out, and with many of her friends and colleagues joining the war effort, Edith signed up to be a nurse, having finished her exams in philosophy, history, and literature. This was against her mother's will. She asked her mother permission, her mother refused, and she said, "Then I will go without your blessing." And so she worked in a hospital for contagious diseases in Monrovia. It also has to be remembered that being a nurse in war was considered not only physically dangerous, but morally dangerous. It was not exactly a safe environment to be in. She, however, didn't stay out in the war very long. She returned after 6 months and began her dissertation on empathy. The war, however, would be very influential on her. In a number of her writings, she's able to use the experience of the soldiers as part of her reflections. And you see that come out, especially when she's talking about how we function as a community and as a group. She sees the experiences of a group of soldiers, a team of soldiers working together, as being some prime experience to be thinking about how those group dynamics work. The full dissertation that she wrote on empathy has been lost. What we have is the published version of it. She graduated summa cum laude, which was quite phenomenal as a student of Husserl's and as a woman. So this was under Husserl. Empathy is an interesting problem, and it's one that she will return to throughout her entire life. This understanding of empathy. What she means by empathy is not quite what we mean in English. Empathy is our ability to recognize, our ability to experience somebody else having an experience. It's our ability to experience somebody else having an experience. So some of the examples she gives. She talks about walking down a hall in school, and one of her friends comes running up to her, and she can feel her friend's joy. She can feel her joy. She has no idea why she's feeling joy. It's not simply a deduction of, well, she's running towards me, she has a smile on her face, therefore she must be feeling joy. She actually feels her friend's joy. And she may have had a very bad day so far. She may have no joy of her own. And yet she feels her friend's joy. Another example, a friend tells me that he has lost his brother, and I become aware of his pain. So we feel other people having experiences other than our own. To put it in very sort of technical terms, we experience a phenomena of foreign psychic life. Okay? So to sort of deductively prove that other people exist is rather difficult. Okay? But we experience other people experiencing. We experience other people's joy. We experience other people's pain through this faculty of empathy. Empathy then allows us to come to know another person as person. To know that another person is person and to recognize them as such. As someone like me. Who is a seat of experiences. Okay? In the same way that I am a seat of experiences. it also allows us to identify things like animals and living things, right? When you see an animal, you know that it's living. Even if it's standing still, you can, as it were, feel the fact that it has sensations. You can almost see that it has sensations, right? And the higher the animal, the easier that is. There are lower animals where it's more difficult to tell that they are living, okay? But the higher the animal, the closer it is, in a sense, to us, the more you can see that. It's also through empathy. Empathy, she also says, is the condition of the possibility of knowledge of the existing world. Okay? It's the condition of the possibility of objective knowledge. And so Edith Stein, through empathy, not only argues for other persons, but actually argues for the existence of the whole world. That we can know that through empathy. When I see the chair in front of me, and I notice how you all look at the chair in front of me, okay, I recognize it as a thing that other people can experience from different places, different positions. It has an objectivity about it. Okay? The elephant in the room right now, on the other hand, is something that only belongs to my mind and not to the rest of yours. And it doesn't have the same objective quality. Even if I am picturing an elephant in the room right now, I can recognize it as not being something that others are experiencing. Right? It doesn't have that quality whereby I can understand it being observed from other positions. Because I recognize it being principally in my mind. This is something we do. It's very interesting when we observe, when we experience something, and we're not sure about our experience. What's the first thing we do? We ask somebody else. You know, is it hot in here? Okay, did you see that? Right? We ask somebody else. We want to know if it's objective. Okay? We haven't, in those cases, we haven't really been able to grasp it emphatically. Okay? We've struggled to grasp it emphatically. We want to know if it's objective. But when we're certain that we heard something, when we're certain that we see something, we don't ask other people. Because we realize that it is the kind of thing that other people will see and hear and grasp as well. Okay? The reason that nobody doubted the world existed until Descartes proved that it existed is because we have this basic faculty of empathy that nobody ever had to describe before. We just had it. And it just meant that by common sense, we recognized other people as other people. We recognized the world as existing. It really wasn't that difficult. Okay? It's only when philosophy is sort of broken down and started to doubt everything, okay, that we have to then go and dig down and find why was it that we were able to simply assume that other people existed and the world existed. Any questions on that? I love her early work. I absolutely love her early work. I think it's so interesting and so fascinating. Even though it's from her non-Catholic period. And I think what's really interesting and fascinating about it is that it winds up jiving so much with the Catholic thought that comes later. And I think it's this very intense attempt to get to truth that leads her to the Catholic Church. And she recognizes in the Catholic Church and in the Catholic faith the very things she had discovered in her own work earlier. Husserl moves to Freiburg, and she follows him, and she becomes his assistant. She starts teaching the introductory classes, the philosophical kindergarten in Phenomenology. She also begins editing his works, his second book of ideas. She would do the vast majority of the editing of this work. Husserl wrote in shorthand, which was atrocious apparently, and then he never edited anything he wrote. So somebody had to go through and actually pour through all of this information that was not written in complete sentences and barely made any sense and make books out of it. That was her job. To be an assistant to Husserl was an extremely high honor. Her replacement would be Martin Heidegger, who is one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. A big part of Alistair McIntyre's book is comparing Edith Stein to Heidegger. It's his opportunity to take pot shots at Heidegger, but it's worth reading just for that, actually. She's also attempting to habilitate. In the European system, in order to become a full professor, you have to write 2 dissertations. The second of which is called your habilitation. So she's attempting to habilitate. She was denied habilitation 3 times. The first 2 was because she was a woman. At this point, there had only been 1 or 2 women in all of German history that had actually become full professors, that had actually habilitated, and none of them in philosophy. So she was really working against the tide. By her 3rd time, it's the fact that she is Jewish that makes it impossible for her to habilitate. She was, however, recognized by Husserl as one of his greatest students. And so he held her in a very high regard and a very high honor. At this time, her work goes deeper into personalism. She recognizes in the person, and this draws out of her work in empathy, 3 spheres of experience: the body, the soul, and the spirit. The bodily experience is just our physical experience of the world. The soul is that emotional, that living sort of experience that we have. The spiritual, to understand that, we have to understand a certain German word, Geist or geistig, okay, which could be translated as mind, but it has no connotations that have to do with the brain. Usually we think of mind and we think of brains. It's something we do in English. It can be translated as spirit, but usually in English when we think of something that's spirit or spiritual, we automatically think about religious things. And it doesn't really have that connotation either. So it's actually a very, very useful word. In philosophy, it allows theists and atheists alike to talk about a certain experience of the human being without becoming materialists on the one hand and without becoming religious on the other. So it really allows for some great conversation. This experience through our spirit is our ability really to transcend the rest of the world. Okay, what the Greeks recognized as that transcendence that we have, whereby the world, we can set the world as it were at a distance. Okay, and we can observe it at a distance. There's something about us that's able to separate from the world and see it differently. Okay, to abstract. It's not something that we see in animals. Animals tend to live in their environment. Okay, they are aware of what is around them and what is available to their senses. We can abstract and we can stand back. We can write books on grammar and logic and math. Okay, we can observe world trends. We can do all of these different levels of abstraction. This is the spiritual element, the experience as spirit. Okay, and ultimately we experience these 3. We have these 3 spheres of experience, but we experience them as a unity, as a psychosomatic spiritual unity, she calls it. Okay, and yet all of this issues from what she recognizes as an incommunicable personal core. That all of our actions, all of our thoughts, all of our experiences carry this kind of stamp of our own individuality, our own personal individuality. What she means by person, the person is a subject. It's a who. It's not merely a what or a thing. The person is capable, on the one hand, of a kind of deep knowledge, a deep self-knowledge, the ability to collect oneself interiorly. Okay? And on the other hand, a kind of freedom, a self-direction. And personalists speak of the combination of these two, the self-knowledge and the self-direction, as a self-possession that marks the person. Okay. You'll see these two themes, these two elements in John Paul II's writing as well. Okay. He will speak about the self-knowledge and self-direction, which of course corresponds very well to a scholastic sense of the intellect and will, the powers of the intellect and the will. The person is pictured as encompassing the body and the soul, but at the same time maintains the image from Stein's early work as being an interior point of individuality that unfolds and gives a particular character to the acts performed by the person. Any questions on sort of Edith Stein's philosophical background?
How much of it really comes from Husserl and her studies under him?
There is a lot of influence. At the same time, though, I think tracing her influence more to Rene is a little better. Husserl, in his first book of Ideas, seemed to go in a sort of idealistic, transcendental approach that all of his students interpreted him as abandoning realism. And that's exactly what his students had come to him for. They thought he was a realist. This was giving us a way of doing philosophy as realists. And he seemed to abandon that. Now, there are a lot of contemporary philosophers that want to defend him and say that he was always a realist. His own students didn't think so. Edith Stein remains part of that camp, part of that original camp that very much saw phenomenology as a realist philosophy. And so following Adolf Rene, Max Scheler, Dietrich von Hildebrand, whom she didn't have much contact with, but still in that sort of camp. So there is quite a bit of influence. There's another very interesting question of how much she influenced him. Since she was so involved in editing the second book of Ideas, you see a lot of her influence in it. And a lot of her thought winds up getting reflected in there. Of course, she didn't do the final steps of editing for it. Martin Heidegger did that, and so he took full credit for it. So you won't see her name on the work anywhere. But still, you see a great deal of her influence in that work. Edith Stein's conversion was something she considered very personal. And so it's never something she actually talks about directly, never something she fully explains. And so we can only sort of guess at what it was that caused her conversion to the Catholic faith. One of the first obvious things, I think, in 1917, Adolf Rene was killed in World War I. Before he went to the war, he and his wife had recently converted to Christianity and had been baptized. Okay? Edith Stein goes to comfort his widow and expects to find a woman who is distraught and grieving over the loss of her husband. And instead, she finds a woman who is very strong in her faith and is actually the source of comfort for all of Reineck's friends who are grieving. And that made a very deep impression on Edith Stein. She recognized that the Christian faith was the source of strength for Frau Reineck. And that very much impressed her. Her association with Max Scheler definitely was an introduction to Catholicism and to Catholic thought. And that seems to have been very influential. But the clearest thing, the clearest story that we know occurred in the summer of 1921 while visiting a friend and a fellow female phenomenologist, Hedwig Conrad Martius. Hedwig and her husband had gone to bed, and she had stayed up, and she goes over to the coffee table and she finds the autobiography of St. Teresa of Avila. And she sits down in the chair and she opens it up and she starts reading. And she stays up all night and reads all the way through it. And she closed the book, she put it down, and she said, "This is truth." That morning, she went out, she bought a catechism, she bought a Roman Missal, and she went to the nearest rectory, knocked on the door, and told the priest that she wanted to be received into the church now. He did get her to wait about 6 months. She was baptized on January 1st in 1922. She began teaching in an all-girls school in Speyer. And an all-girls school run by Dominican sisters, which is very interesting in her works on women, which we'll get to soon. When she talks about religious life, she's very clearly talking about Dominican sisters' religious life. This becomes her initial understanding of what religious life is. She wanted to enter religious life right away, but she wasn't allowed to. Her confessor wouldn't allow her to. One was because of her relationship with her mother. Her mother, still a very devout Jew, was very upset by her conversion. And it was seen as very untoward to upset her even more through entering the convent. Also the newness of her conversion, having just converted. We still do that today, making sure that people have really interiorized the Catholic life before we have them enter religious life. Also her importance in the philosophical world. And it was seen as it would be better for her to continue her work in the philosophical world rather than enter the convent. She soon begins doing translation work. The first thing she started translating was she was given the letters of Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman to translate into German. So she begins doing translation work. After that, she was given St. Thomas Aquinas' De Veritate, and asked to do a free German translation of De Veritate. When she had first converted, she had every intention of giving up philosophy. She explains this: immediately before, and for a good while after my conversion, I was of the opinion that to lead a religious life meant one had to give up all that was secular and to live totally immersed in the thoughts of the divine. That it is possible to worship God by doing scholarly research is something I learned, actually, only when I was busy with St. Thomas. And so it's through the study of the De Veritate and the translation of it that she realizes that faith and reason really do go together. That in entering into this conversion into the Catholic faith, she didn't have to give up her philosophy. She didn't have to give up those studies and those pursuits of reason. That they really could be done as a prayer. And so, she begins speaking on sort of the, shall we say, the Catholic conference circuit in Germany. She starts touring around giving talks. And the focus of her talks, as she is working with young girls, educating young girls at an all-girls school, is the education of women. And to understand the education of women, to get at how are we to educate women, we have to ask about the nature and the vocation of women. Her talks are collected in a volume of her work simply called Woman. Okay? And these are all talks. They were popular talks, so they were meant for a general audience on the nature and the vocation of women. A book I highly recommend picking up and reading. It's a fascinating, fascinating book. Stein discusses, in her discussion of women, she says, no woman is only woman. Okay. There are three aspects she wants to reflect on in every woman. Her humanity, on the one hand. Her nature and vocation is going to flow out of her humanity. Her individuality. Okay. Nature and vocation is going to flow out of that as well. And her femininity. So there are these three sort of spheres that you have to keep in mind when we are talking about women or about men. Humanity, individuality, and then femininity or masculinity. And these affect the whole of the person. Body, soul, and spirit. Okay? And this is evident if you ask a doctor. Okay? Masculinity and femininity does affect your physical being, according to doctors. This is true if you ask a psychologist. Okay? It's true if you ask a spiritual director. Okay? Masculinity and femininity affects the whole of the person. But that feminine in the woman is expressed in different ways in every woman because she is an individual. Okay. So it may be expressed in greater or lesser degrees. Okay. Each woman in the course of her formation or even deformation, okay, may express it in different ways. Edith Stein will use the language of specific difference to describe men and women. It's a use of a scholastic term. It's a kind of misuse of a scholastic term, but we'll forgive her for that. She says, I am convinced that the species humanity embraces the double species man and woman. That the essence of the complete human being is characterized by this duality. And that the entire structure of the essence demonstrates the specific character. There's a difference not only in bodily structure and in particular physiological functions, but also in the entire corporeal life. The relationship of soul to body differs in their psychic life, as well as that of their spiritual faculties to each other. The feminine species expresses a unity and wholeness of the total psychosomatic personality and a harmonious development of the faculties. The masculine species strives to enhance the individual abilities in order that they may attain their highest achievement. Okay, so she really sees masculinity and femininity as being two very different things, to the point she calls them different species. Okay, and they are governed nonetheless by this individuality that each one of us has, and we'll see that in some detail. Seeing some of my pages were not printed correctly. That's okay. All right. So some of her descriptions about women. First, she describes women as having a stronger connection between the physical and the spiritual than men. The woman's soul is present and lives more intensely in all parts of the body and is inwardly affected by what happens to the body, whereas with men, the body has a more pronounced character as an instrument, which serves them in their work and is accompanied by a certain detachment. Okay. She also says that women have a certain strength that lies in their emotional life. The strength of the woman lies in the emotional life. Woman's particular gift for emotions is not to say that she does not have cognitive ability and cannot engage intellectually at the level of men. But rather what it is just to say is that it is a certain strength of theirs. While Stein's own work would dismiss this, right? She is working at that highest level of philosophical inquiry in phenomenology. Okay. She does see, however, that women are generally less suited for outstanding achievement in objective fields. They are naturally less concerned with the objective and the impersonal, but rather have a deep interest in the living, the personal, and the holistic. So for Edith Stein, she would very much expect that in fields like theoretical physics, in fields like philosophy, you are going to find more men than women. You're going to find more men because it's a particularly masculine quality to enhance individual abilities in order that they may attain their highest achievement. Okay? To push for that objective achievement. Now, there may be individual women who also have this gift as individuals. And so you will find some women in these fields, but probably not very many. On the other hand, when you look at fields like nursing, fields like elementary education, where there has to be this radical concern for the whole person, for the whole of the other, okay, the whole development of the child, okay, the whole care of the patient, you are very likely to find more women in those situations than men. Again, there may be men who have an individual gift for that and are found in those fields. But Edith Stein is not going to be surprised that there aren't very many of them. Okay? So she is very much an advocate that there shouldn't be any field that bars either sex from entering into it. But at the same time, you shouldn't be surprised that in some fields you see a radical disproportionality of the two sexes. Okay. Women also have a special gift for empathy that allows them more easily to recognize the uniqueness of individuals. She also thinks that women have a particular gift oriented to the transcendent. A specific gift for the spiritual values, particularly the good and the beautiful. And a singular sensitivity to moral values and an abhorrence of all that is mean and low. Combining all of these, a woman is specially suited to attend to the needs of others and to bring about their perfection. So based on the essence of a woman, as she's described her, Edith Stein sees two different vocations that belong to every woman. That is the vocations of mother and companion. Companion or spouse, she draws this language, this is from an analysis of Genesis, where Eve is created as a helper fit for Adam. To be a companion means to be a support and mainstay, And to be able to be so, a woman herself must stand firmly. However, this is only possible if inwardly everything is in the right order and rests in equilibrium. To be in right order is to have the intellect governing the will and both of them governing the senses. This prevents emotionalism from taking over the woman's life. Okay. And against those who would suggest that maybe motherhood is not necessarily part of a woman's vocation, she says, only a person blinded by the passion of controversy could say that that a woman's soul and body is not formed for a very particular purpose. Okay. The body and the soul of the woman is formed for motherhood. Motherhood for Stein is the total meaning of the woman. The feminine essence and its associated body is oriented first and foremost to motherhood. To be a mother, she says, is to nourish and protect true humanity and bring it to development. Okay. A mother must know the purpose to which she raises her children. She must be open to their development and wary of dangers that come before them. The mother must be selfless and not see others as a means to her own ends. She must be able to let go and to trust the action of God when her children are grown and then moving gradually from being the mother to being their companion as mature human beings. Doing these things, the woman becomes not only the heart of her family, but also the most important agent in the improvement of society. Thus, we are able to recapitulate in one word, motherliness, that which we have developed as a characteristic value of woman. Now, of course, then Edith Stein will go through and she'll analyze these ideas of companion and mother in all of the different states of life. Okay, whether a woman is single, whether she is married, or whether she is religious. Okay, and how they play out. Okay, but that they play out, that they need to play out in every woman's life, is something that she is certain of. Okay, so these are lived out as a wife and mother in other natural vocations that come very naturally to a woman, such as nursing, such as teaching, and also in the religious life. Any questions on Edith Stein's feminism?
Is what you're talking about now, is that in the book called Woman?
It is. It is, yeah. So.
I don't know, question or whatever. Looking at it, but women, it also depends on when I look at her and I look at what she says and what she writes. I think a lot of it also has to do with how much education you have. I mean, is a woman or anything, she was highly educated, and therefore she looked at it from a very different intellectual way than some women that never learned how to read or write or totally have, this is in front of me, I am a mother or whatever, and that's it, or somebody that's single or so. Or to be a nurse or so. There are many professions that are like a teacher or like other things that is helping other people out.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really see, I know this was her philosophy, okay? And I think it's wonderful, but I think women are absolute just as much individuals as men are.
Oh, yes. Now, she doesn't do an entire analysis of men, right? She doesn't do that.
Right.
But she'd probably say the same kind of things.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, but you know what I'm saying, because, I mean, there there are women that are natural mothers, if they're married or not, but they just have this mother instinct, nurturing, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And other mothers, there can be mothers of 10 kids that don't have a clue how to be a mother.
So she would ascribe that to individuality,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And she would ascribe that also to formation,
Yes.
to just our formation in life. So I think she'd see those points.
Yeah.
In 1933, it became illegal for Jews to teach at all in Germany. And Husserl was forced into retirement. He was also of Jewish background. He was forbidden to use the library in Freiburg. And many others were scattered as well. Since she was banned from teaching anywhere, and her relationship with her mother was improving, she was finally allowed by her confessor to enter into religious life. And so she entered Carmel in Cologne at the age of 42, which would be considered a late vocation today. It was a very late vocation at her time. She received the habit and began her novitiate receiving the name Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. Okay. This is a picture from the clothing ceremony. It was very traditional to wear a wedding dress to the clothing ceremony. The wedding dress was provided by her sister Rosa, who had come to be convinced of the Catholic faith as well. Though Rosa would not convert until the death of their mother, she fully supported Edith in entering religious life. So she begins writing a number of spiritual works, including her final philosophical work, which was Finite and Eternal Being, which is what I did most of my thesis on. It was an attempt to bring medieval philosophy together with phenomenology and Husserl in the area of metaphysics. Ultimately, it's a project that I think fails. But it's very important that somebody did the project to see that it would fail, to see that it wouldn't work. And so it really is an important work for looking at how phenomenology is going to interface with the tradition of philosophy in the church. And what you'll find, I think, is where phenomenology really does do a lot of great work and is very helpful in our theology and our philosophy in the church, is particularly in moral discussions. Okay, so John Paul II puts it to great use in his theology of the body. Okay, you'll find Dietrich von Hildebrand writing on the life of virtues, puts it to great use. Metaphysics, maybe not so much. It's much better to, as John Paul II really does, sort of stick to a traditional Thomistic metaphysics and have that undergird your philosophy and theology, and then use phenomenology as a tool in the moral life. Just when her relationship with her mother was starting to improve, her mother took ill. It had been a great gift to her mother that Edith was born on Yom Kippur. It would be a great gift to Sister Teresa Benedicta of the Cross that her mother passed away on September 14th, the feast of the Exaltation of the Cross. It's a tremendous little exchange of life and death for the two of them. After their mother's death, Rosa felt more free to follow Edith into her conversion, and so she was baptized on Christmas Eve in 1936. But by 1938, things have gotten significantly worse for the Jews in Germany. And so Edith Stein, Sister Teresa, flees to Holland. And her sister, through a number of very difficult struggles, was able to join her in 1940. But that same year, Hitler invaded Holland. And so the Stein sisters were forced to go out and report to the SS regularly, forced to wear the Yellow Star of David, so they were watched as being of Jewish descent, even though they had converted and become Catholic. Stein continues her writing. Her last work was called The Science of the Cross. It was a phenomenological reflection on the works of St. John of the Cross, which really, I think, St. John of the Cross becomes even closer to her and to her thought than Teresa was. He becomes very important to her. We have the original manuscript of this. We can see that she was running out of ink. They didn't have an ink supply, so she keeps watering down her ink. So the ink gets lighter and lighter as she starts writing. And then there's a chapter sort of in the middle, which appears to be the last thing we know that she wrote. It has the lightest ink of all. And it's again a reflection on the person, which was such an important philosophical theme in her life, that she writes and sticks in the middle of this work. And all through this time, she is starting to have a sense of the centrality of the cross in her life. And she begins to have this growing desire to offer herself up for her people. And she's writing and she's speaking with her superiors. She has this sense that God is going to ask the ultimate sacrifice of her. She says in one reflection, "I am certain that the Lord has accepted my life for all. Esther has been chosen from her people, specifically to intercede for them before the king. I am a little Esther, poor and powerless, but the king who has chosen me is infinitely great and merciful, and this is a profound consolation." From the time of her conversion, Stein's devotion, her humility, her love of the Lord, her spiritual life are things that are recognized by everyone. Okay? She became a very deeply spiritual person. Many of the sisters didn't even know she was a famous philosopher. She was so humble and so quiet in her ways. She was absolutely pathetic in doing the basic domestic work around the house. I'm sure a number of them wondered why the heck she had been accepted and what was going on with this 42-year-old woman entering religious life. But there's a great depth and of holiness in her life, leading up to the end. On July 26, 1942, the Dutch bishops issued a pastoral letter against the deportation of the Jews. The church is often accused of not doing anything during the Holocaust. The church did do quite a bit. And this is one example. And this is one example that taught the church quite a lesson. The punishment for the letter was swift and brutal. The SS officers came in to the convent and told Edith and Rosa that they had 5 minutes to pack, and they were being deported. All of the Jews, all of those of Jewish descent, who had been part of the Catholic and other Christian churches, who had been allowed to remain and not be deported, at this point were all deported because of what the Catholic bishops did. Okay? They spoke out, and the punishment was dealt to them. There are some beautiful descriptions of Sister Teresa at this time. Her sister Rosa was very distraught and upset. And Sister Teresa apparently just took her hand and said, "Come, we go. Let us go for the sake of our people." And they willingly followed the SS officers and were taken away. There are multiple stories about her traveling and visiting the different places where the people were being held. She was a source of comfort and peace in the midst of the turmoil. Mothers were often so distraught that they couldn't take care of their children, so she took care of them, comforting the children, bringing people together in prayer. She becomes, there are multiple comments that we have on record of her work as she's traveling along on her way to Auschwitz. She arrived in Auschwitz early on the morning of August 9th. At the age of 50, she was not seen as somebody who was very useful for work, and so she was killed in the gas chambers on that day. St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross was canonized as a martyr. And there's been some debate and some controversy over that. Did she die really as a Catholic martyr? I think when you look at her own understanding of her life, her own writings leading up to this time, she understood that God was asking her to give up her life, to offer herself as a martyr. She is deported, yes, because she is a Jew, but because the Catholic Church spoke out against the Nazis. That's why she is rounded up at that time. And so there is a defense of the Catholic faith in that. And so I think it's not inappropriate that we see her really as a martyr for the faith. Certainly, that seems to be what the Lord had put on her heart and in her understanding leading up to that. So then, just very briefly, some of the gifts of St. Edith Stein that she leaves for us. I think she leaves a beautiful corpus of philosophical works that are fascinating to read. They're asking a very different set of questions from what some of the what the philosophy before had been asking and what contemporary philosophy is asking today. Again, if you look to Alistair MacIntyre's book, he's going to suggest that really we need to get back to the kind of questions she was asking. Even if we don't agree with her answers, we need to get back to those kind of questions. That it would have been a much better track to follow her questions than to follow Heidegger's questions in the 20th century. She leaves to us a beautiful philosophical and Catholic account of women, of feminism, which has gone through so much turmoil in the 20th century. Her work was certainly influential on John Paul II. He does take some different sides on certain issues. He doesn't completely agree with her, but still at the same time very influential and a very beautiful look, a very, very beautiful understanding, a way of feminism, a Catholic way of looking at feminism. She leaves behind some beautiful spiritual works, particularly that final work on St. John of the Cross. And she leaves for us an example of great humility and of a willingness to follow Christ to the end. That example of the martyr. Willing to die for her people, the Jews, but recognizing that as being deeply connected with her relationship to God as a Catholic religious, as a Carmelite, and of her way of ascending with our Lord onto the cross. So, and with that, if there are any questions, we can...
Could you tell me a little bit more when she said, it was to her sister, let's go for our evil?
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell me a little bit more about, how kind of like why is of the duplication, or how did that help the Jews, or is that to go to help them in the concentration camp, or in the...
I think she had, the question is, what did she mean by the statement, let us go to die for our people? She understood herself as offering herself as a sacrifice, as uniting her death, which she seemed to foresee, as uniting that to the suffering of Christ on the cross. And so very much that Catholic understanding of suffering, and that redemptive understanding of suffering, and that our suffering can be united to Christ's suffering and therefore become redemptive. And so really as a kind of sacrifice for the Jewish people. I think she really saw herself as that.
Where does Benedict XVI fall in terms of phenomenology and his friendship with John Paul?
That's not going to be a major field of study for him, and he's not going to engage philosophy in that way. At the same time, though, it's very influential throughout the whole of the 20th century, and so it's there are certain elements of it that are going to creep into sort of everybody's kind of work and experience, but you're not going to get anything directly engaging the phenomenological from Pope Benedict. In the back, yeah.
The slide on empathy.
Uh-huh.
The key step seems to be the experience of someone else experiencing. How is that indubitable that it's someone else, not some projection, some made up, some random firing of neurons?
It's so to begin, you would bracket off that question, whether or not the other person really exists, right? So you would begin by bracketing that off. She wants to argue that we experience it as not being from us. We experience it as its source is different. Its source is alien to us. So to extend the example of the joy, the friend coming. So I have this experience of her joy. I recognize her joy. But it's not my joy. And there's a dissonance, especially if I've had a bad day and I don't have any particular feeling or sense of joy right now. And yet I experience this joy, I recognize it's not my own. Then as she comes to me and tells me that she has passed her exams and she's very excited, and I become very excited for her. And now I have an experience of joy, but it's a very different experience of joy. It actually is my joy for her. So I can recognize those two very different moments of joy. One was something that didn't come from me. There's no reason for it to come from me. It's experienced as coming from someone else, from someplace else. And then the experience of joy that wells up within me. That we experience as coming from within me. So that's her description of it. And we can certainly argue with that and discuss how it works or not. But does that make sense, the distinction between the two experiences?
Would you say that she says that it's common sense?
I think a lot of what she is diving into is trying to explain what we just take to be common sense, right? And common sense, even in that traditional way of speaking, which is just that ability of the mind to put together everything that's going around and make sense of it, just make a simple sense of it, right? That what I see and what I touch get put together in my mind as the same object. I mean, it's just the basic common sense. And that's what she's trying to piece that apart to show that there really is something there. That it's not just a sort of wishful thinking or sort of or merely a naivete. That there really is something there. We really do have a reason for trusting that kind of experience.
You said that she gave up completely her Jewish faith, but in the end of her life, she was very pleased to be Jewish.
Yes.
And she says, my Jewish blood flows in me, just like Jesus was Jew, and his blood flowed in him.
Yeah.
So she had this in common, that her blood was like the same as Jesus.
Yeah.
Both were Jewish.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, very much. That was certainly by the end. That is her understanding of what's going on in her life. Yeah. We had.
Other than in feminism, can you pinpoint ways that she's influenced Pope John Paul II's writing?
I think her personalism also. So her understanding of the person. At the very least, she is a key player in those discussions at that time. And he's going to draw from those discussions. So whether or not it's a direct influence or just she's influencing the discussion and so he's drawing from that, I think is definitely there. He certainly read her Finite and Eternal Being. And so he knew about her project to bring phenomenology and scholasticism together. So.
Was Heidegger a Nazi?
It's a little off topic. Heidegger did everything he could to maintain a position of prominence during the Nazi regime. It doesn't seem like he necessarily agreed with anything that they promoted, but he was willing to do whatever it took to maintain his position. So he is. It's said that he was the one that actually issued the letter to Husserl, telling him that he had been relieved of his duties and was forbidden to use the library, which he said he claimed was not true. His friends also, though, knew him to be a compulsive liar, so that's sort of a dicey situation to.
Well, there are pictures of him in leader houses.
I would.
Nazi rallies.
Yes, he towed the line, if you will. So.
Where does intuition fit in with her empathy? Is there a connection?
Can you repeat the question?
Where does intuition fit in with empathy?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, where does intuition fit in with empathy?
Oh, you were introducing your answer.
I
think you mean intuition as we normally talk about it?
Talk about women's intuition, and I'm sorry to sound sexy.
Yeah, I think when we talk about a woman's intuition, we're reflecting on what she calls that ability to sort of. I think empathy is very much as close to that. To the ability to recognize something going on in another person, especially, or to recognize how something is going to cause an effect in another person, right? The ability to be concerned with ambience, with atmosphere in a room, right, is very much draws on empathy, that ability to recognize how somebody else is going to perceive and be affected by it. Yeah. Let's just do one more.
Did she ever consciously write about the topic that is commonly called artificial intelligence today?
You know what? Not that I know of. There are she does. There's a very full set of lectures on anthropology, where I wondered if there was one place she covered it, it might have been there. Those have not been translated to English yet. I've read some of them in Spanish because my German is not a place where I can read. Yeah, so not that I know of, not that I've seen anything of. So, right. Well, thank you very much.